Hello, listeners. Welcome to Marie Lives the Horror. This is episode 38 of the series of True Paranormal Ghost Stories. Tonight's episode will be featuring strange and terrifying encounters with the mysterious entities known as jinns. In this day and age, there does seem to be a lot of physical and visual evidence for the existence of these beings. With this in mind, what do you all think the jinn actually are? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Tonight's episode is presented in collaboration with Papa Scare. He has an excellent horror narration channel as well that I highly recommend all of my listeners to check out. I guarantee you'll all leave his channel subscribed and satisfied. So without further ado, step into my horror chamber as we live the horror together.
My unit in the US Army was deployed to Iraq in April of 2006. We were in Ramadi. It was 123 kilometers, 77 miles, out of Baghdad. I was in a Humvee, headed to Baghdad for emergency leave due to a death in my family. It was close to midnight. The Humvee I was in with 3 others and a turret gunner. The 2 other Humvee, the same 5 total people. 1 in front, 1 in back. I was without a weapon due to my leave. The Humvee in front stopped hard. We all figured it was a possible IED or VBIED. The team leader in our Humvee radioed to the lead Humvee. The convo went along these lines. From this point forward, Humvee will be called HV. HV1. Something flew in front of the HV. HV2. What? Flew in front of the HV? HV1. Yes. HV2. We didn't see anything. And the third HV piped in. Does anyone hear the hello? HV1. Yes. HV2. Our HV. Yes, but I don't see it. Did the other 2 vehicles? Just then, in the desert off the highway was a black figure. It looked like a huge bird. It looked like smoke was emitting from it. A blackish, greenish smoke with a bit of a blue tinge. We all focused our eyes. The 2 troops with better NODs, night vision, could see something but couldn't make out what it was. The smoke was distorting the view. Within a second or 2, a rock was thrown at one of the HV. A big rock, like the size of a head. We all froze. Due to the rules of engagement, we couldn't just light it up. We used a spotlight, and in that light, something flew straight up, and then we heard a loud screeching noise. Within a minute, it was over. We all sat there in a state of shock, curiosity, and panic. When we got to Baghdad, the translator that they were picking up to bring to the Marines that were with us, he said, "Sounds like you encountered an Ifrit." Team leader said, "A what?" "Ifrit. A winged jinn." We were all a bit speechless. We chose not to disclose to our command about the winged thing, as battle fatigue, now known as PTSD, was a career killer at this juncture. It's been 13 years since this happened. I met my now husband in 2015, and he had also been deployed to Ramadi with my sister unit at the time, and he went through this particular stretch of highway on his mid-deployment leave. He recounted a similar story to me. It was enough to stop me in my tracks. It was pretty close to mine, except they didn't stop, they just boogied on through. Considering the time they were there was very deadly, including an aid station manned by soldiers that was ambushed and blown to bits. I was a medic, so death was my norm. I still can't wrap my mind around it. And now apparently the last 2 places I lived in, something has followed us.
Okay, so this happened when I was 12 or 13. I live in Turkey, and every year my family and I go to my dad's hometown, which is a really old village that doesn't even have internet. That year we went there again, and when we go there, I usually hang out with my cousins. We are all the same age group. That day we were like 6 people, so we did our normal routine of just running around the village, and we decided to visit the graveyard that is outside of the village. My grandparents' house is also close to this graveyard and outside of the village. The weather was getting pretty cloudy and it looked like it was about to rain, so we got spooked out a bit. We also were speaking of demons, evil entities, and jinns. Naturally, we just got too scared and decided to go back to my grandparents' house. We got there and got into the big house. There is also a small one that belongs to my grandpa, but the big one is for us. We got there, sat in the living room, which is on the 2nd floor, and stupidly decided to keep this scary talk going, even going as far as to mock the entities. My cousins went all the way with it, and as the conversation keeps going, all of us kept getting even more scared. A few of my cousins tried to stop the talk, but failed. Eventually, one of my cousins said, and I quote, "If anybody, jinns, if you are here, close the door." We all looked at each other, waiting for something to happen for a few seconds. It doesn't, and my cousins keep the mocking going. After about a minute or two, the door slams shut, makes a loud sound, and we all start screaming and we try to open the door, but it doesn't open. Mind you, the door is really heavy and hard to open and close. We panic even more, and luckily my older sister and older cousins came to our rescue. They later said they heard all the screaming. Honestly, I don't know if it was a coincidence, but it was too timed to be one. I cried so hard after that incident. It was really scary as a kid. My sister brought this story up to me a couple of times, and every single time she does, I get creeped out. This happened to my sister a couple of years ago in our apartment. She was in my parents' room praying. We are Muslim, so my sister was wearing a headscarf and long skirt to pray with. My parents' room has a huge mirrored closet, so my sister was praying in front of it, which is a big nope for me. So as she is praying, she hears someone open the room door behind her. While they open it, she told me that everyone that was home was in the living room. So as she bends over while praying, she hears footsteps behind her coming closer. Because she is bending down, she can't see from the skirt. So as she rises up to standing, she looks in the mirror and makes a dash to the living room, not even finishing her prayer. She said that in the mirror, she's seen a tall black figure behind her and attempted to wrap its long arms around her when she stood up. She said as she ran, she looked back and still seen it in the mirror. She ran to my dad and told him, and he said it was nothing. Still dumbfounded, she asked him later and he said, yeah, that was a jinn. For anyone who doesn't know what jinn is, it's what people like to call shadow people. I can go into more details about jinns, but it's not good to keep talking about them. They can haunt people the more you talk about them. Another time, like maybe about a year ago, my sister said how she was laying in bed on her phone when everyone was asleep and she had her foot hanging out of the bed. Another big nope from me. Anyways, she said how something just wrapped its hand around her foot and she froze. She didn't know what to do and just stood still, terrified of what was holding her foot. She said it started to then stroke her foot and finally let go. I guess her jinn or ghost had a foot fetish. Anyways, I just wanted to share this with everyone.
I was a sergeant in the US Army and ETSing, getting out, from the military when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home to Austin, Texas, when I was summoned into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army, but the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving at Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team, overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IED incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of army and civilian vehicles. Because I was an SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while in active duty, I was technically still in the Guard. I was often on the convoys, manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad, known then as Camp Babylon, occupied by French troops but then designated as an archaeological site for obvious reasons. Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to originally be inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood at that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first incident seems a bit benign, but sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time, standard operating procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because in the past, such incidents ended up being a lone gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the SOP changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for the enemy. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to move about the area. Several times we would spot the figures, but they would immediately disappear. A contractor lying beside me with his weapon commented how odd that we are in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural. I didn't respond, but knew he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon, etc. I didn't feel at the time that much was supernatural, but certainly did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart about the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the army mechanics took a look at the vehicle, and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used NVG's, night vision goggles, to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving towards the set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony mixed with loneliness. On and on the sounds went while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our NVGs equipped, we used our flashlights to spotlight the ruins. If you've ever done this, you will know that a normal flashlight with NVGs looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area, but no source of the wails or the ball of light was seen. About this time, we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my SAW over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor, so I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. It was watching us as we were looking for him, her, or it. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought that he was going to die. He didn't remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee, headed back to Kuwait. I now write non-fiction books about haunted places for Llewellyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots, but I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha and Camp Arifjan, they also were quite horrified. One of them, a translator we called Adi, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agree.
We've all heard the stories. If you're Muslim, it goes something like this. My grandmother once told me that in her grandmother's village back in Pakistan, there was a lone abandoned mansion at the end of town. Yes, I'm talking about jinn, basically ghost stories. We all grew up with them, traded them and transmitted them, and yet weirdly enough, they always happened to some friend's distant relative back in a faraway country, or to an uncle who for some odd reason was at the masjid in the middle of the night 30 years ago and saw the vacuum cleaner flying around by itself. Shout out to any jinn janitors out there keeping the mosques clean. Never did it happen right in front of our eyes here in America. So while I believed in jinn themselves and enjoyed the entertainment of a campfire jinn story, I had a very hard time believing these stories actually happened. Until, that is, the stories happened to me. I never realized how dark it could get with zero light pollution. It was like a pitch black blanket covered everything that should have been in sight. I could barely make out the shadows of objects right in front of me. With nothing to do in this blinding darkness, I settled onto the sleeping bag strewn across the floor of the enormous foreign students' M-bar house tent. While at times this M-bar housed as many as 7 people, now no other students were here. I was alone. My sleep came in fits and bursts. Exhaustion battled the uncomfortableness of sleeping on a concrete floor. I was asleep 1 minute, awake the next, and then asleep again. Suddenly, my eyes snapped open. In the darkness, I saw a man standing in the corner, leaning on the back wall as if he were waiting for me. I couldn't make out his exact figure, except that he was skinny, with a turban and a thin beard. I briefly considered whether I was still asleep, but no, I was definitely awake. This was no doubt my M-bar that I saw around me. This was no doubt the stiff concrete floor that I felt underneath me. I fixed my eyes on this man's shadowy figure. He seemed to notice I was looking because he acknowledged my stare with a curt nod, then immediately began walking over. I couldn't move. I was too paralyzed by fear to do anything more than just lay there and watch as he came closer and closer. Then, as soon as he reached the edge of my sleeping bag, he passed right around and straight out of the tent. This was ridiculous. I had been warned that the Mauritanian villagers don't have much of a sense of privacy and walk into your tent without asking. But this, to barge into my tent in the middle of the night, then stroll out without saying a word. No, sir, this was too much. I grabbed the flashlight beside me, beamed it onto the man just as he was leaving, and hot on his tail, ran out to confront him. This creepster would not get away with his intrusion. Now outside, I swung around my light, searching for the direction he went off to. Left, right, straight ahead. Again and again, I swung my light around, but there was no one there. No man, not even a trace. Confused and still exhausted, I went back to sleep mumbling the Ayat-ul-Kursi. The next day was a blur of studying, reading, eating, and daydreaming about a sweet cold can of Coca-Cola that would never come, and before I knew it, the sun was setting once again. This time, as night inched closer, it brought with it a feeling of extreme dread. I thought of confiding in someone about what I had seen the night before, but the Mauritanians had already deemed me not enough of a man, and I wasn't going to ruin my image further by running over and crying about jinn. So I tried the only other strategy I could think of: stay awake the whole night. Needless to say, that strategy didn't work. Again, exhaustion from the extreme heat overcame me, and I laid down to sleep. Again, my sleep was restless. 1 minute I was awake, the next minute dreaming a terrible dream, and then awake again. Towering over me, I could make out the figure of someone I knew and disliked very, very much. But the situation didn't make any sense. This person I so disliked was supposed to be halfway across the world in America, but here they were, standing over my head in a tiny remote village in Mauritania. I stared up in shock. He glowered down at me. I grabbed my book light from beside me and shined it on his face, hoping it would repel him. It didn't. Unfazed, he continued staring down a menacing stare. I leapt up from my sleeping bag, stumbling backwards. I turned my light on him, ready for whatever confrontation was necessary. If he pursued me to this middle-of-nowhere village at this ungodly hour, then I couldn't just let him go. But there was no confrontation. Whoever was standing over me 1 second ago had vanished into thin air. More frightened than I've ever been in my life, I looked longingly in the direction of Murabit's house, where I had stayed the first night in Tuwaymarat. It would be so much more comfortable to stay there, sleeping close to the sheikh and his family. Surely no jinn would dare come there. But I held back. I must not seem like a scaredy cat, I told myself. I must not seem afraid. A month or two passed without any more visits from these apparitions. Even so, I remained a little scared and always on edge. The Mauritanians continued to frighten me with various stories of jinn. They said, for instance, one lonely night, a student had been sitting at the cell phone spot, about a mile away from the village, casually browsing on his phone, when he felt a pebble thrown at him. He ignored it. Probably another villager playing a prank, he thought. Then, as he continued browsing, he felt someone sit beside him. He glanced up from his phone. Beside him was a strange man with a horribly distorted and ugly face, grinning widely. The stranger had never before been seen around these parts, and he was never seen again. The story was probably more fiction than fact, but it was more than enough to frighten me. Every time I walked off alone to the cell phone spot around 3 a.m. and heard a wolf howling, the wind whooshing, or a stone dropping down the mountain, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. One afternoon, I was flicking through a book titled Purification of the Heart, where I happened upon a chapter about fear that changed my perspective forever. Fear of anything besides God is from a weakness of faith. I thought back to that incredible fear I had of the jinns here, and realized my sense of fear did indeed stem from a weakness in faith. I had been programmed to fear way more than what was natural. Fear has become an industry. Haunted houses, roller coasters, horror movies, thrillers, and like any industry, what started as something grounded in reality has been taken to an extreme in the pursuit of more. We have been taught to fear everything and anything. We used to fear just a monster with a hideous face. Now we fear a little girl coming out of a TV. We used to fear just a mass killer man. Now we fear the possessed killer baby. What used to be a natural reaction to the unnatural became an unnatural reaction to the irrational, a freakish excitement, a passing thrill. A believer knows and fully internalizes the belief that nothing can prevent what God gives, and no one can give what God prevents. The ultimate believer does not fear jinn, because even if that jinn stood a hair's breadth from him and was the most hideous creature he'd ever seen, what could the jinn do without the permission of God? The ultimate believer does not fear another man, because what could that man do without the permission of God? The ultimate believer does not fear a crowd. He does not fear loneliness, an oppressor. He does not fear poverty. He does not fear torture or death. He does not fear anything but the most overwhelming master of the universe. What an amazing, incredible, empowering fear that is. Only 2 weeks remained now until I returned to America. My back had become used to the concrete floor, and my eyes to the darkness that enveloped everything. For months now, I had never seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. Until, when one middle of the night, I gradually awoke. From behind me, I could hear the sound of pouring water. It was almost as if someone had opened the giant carton of water I stored in my ambar, tilted it over so slightly, and was filling their jug slowly and slowly. Someone had come into my tent this late at night and is pouring out my water? Impossible. It must be a cow urinating just outside, as they so often did. Or surely I must be hallucinating. 10 seconds passed. The sound of pouring water continued. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. Cows do not urinate this long. 1 minute. I was definitely wide awake and not hallucinating now. I could clearly make out that the sound of pouring water came from only 2 or 3 feet behind me, precisely where I had left my giant carton of water before going to bed. At that very moment, I was almost certain that I had turned around. I would have seen a figure standing right behind me, pouring out the water. But I didn't turn around. There was no need. Instead, I smiled and thought back to the chapter I had read. Fear of anything besides God is from a weakness of faith. It was almost like God was testing me. I laughed, settled back into bed, and slept like a baby. The man who fears nothing but God has nothing but God to fear. Hello, listeners. Thank you for listening to tonight's episode of True Paranormal Ghost Stories as you live the horror with me. A very special thanks to fellow narrator Papa Scare for joining me on tonight's episode. Be sure to check out his awesome channel. A link to his channel will be down in the description below. If you have a true ghost story that you would like for me to narrate in a future episode, please send me a message to any of my social media links listed down below. Do not forget to subscribe and click on all notifications to keep up with any future content. Thanks again for listening. And as always, I am your host, Marie Lives the Horror.